The Intergalactic Military Academy's Nexus Prime station had seen many things in its 300-year history. Diplomatic incidents involving ambassadors and furniture that wasn't designed for their anatomy, training accidents where cadets accidentally weaponized cafeteria food, even that memorable occasion when a crystalline professor had literally exploded during a particularly heated debate about quantum mechanics. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared the prestigious institution for the moment when human cadet Bellamy Cross decided that academic presentations needed a bit of editorial improvement. The morning had started innocuously enough, which should have been everyone's first warning. Bellamy sat in the back row of Xenobiology 401, looking for all the world like he was paying attention to Professor Hextmar's lecture on comparative species analysis and galactic hierarchy structures. The professor, a being whose crystalline form refracted light in ways that made taking notes both beautiful and nauseating, had been droning on for the better part of an hour about evolutionary advantages and species classification. To be fair to Professor Hextmar, the lecture was supposed to be routine, a simple overview of the galaxy's most dominant species, complete with charts, graphs, and enough statistical analysis to put a computational synthetic to sleep. The kind of presentation that would be broadcast to 47 star systems as part of the Academy's educational outreach program, watched by millions of beings across the galaxy who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday morning. And now, Professor Hextmar announced, his crystalline voice carrying that particular tone of academic satisfaction, we come to the pinnacle of our discussion, the top 5 apex species of the known galaxy. The holographic display shimmered to life above the lecture hall, showing a neatly organized list that had been compiled by committees, reviewed by panels, and approved by councils. It was the kind of official document that carried the weight of bureaucratic certainty, which meant it was probably wrong, but definitely stamped with impressive seals. Number 5, the Vorthak hegemony, masters of biological warfare and genetic manipulation. Their ability to adapt to any environment through controlled evolution had earned them a reputation as the galaxy's most persistent survivors. Number 4, the Synthetic Collective, artificial intelligences who had transcended their organic creators and now viewed biological life with the kind of patient tolerance usually reserved for particularly slow pets. Number 3, the Psionic Dominion, beings of pure mental energy who could rewrite reality with a thought, assuming they could be bothered to think about it. Number 2, the Crystalline Confederacy, Professor Hextmar's own species, masters of technology and logic who had built cities that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. And number 1, the Elder Council, ancient beings who had achieved a level of cosmic awareness that made them functionally indistinguishable from gods, assuming gods spent most of their time filing paperwork. Humanity, if anyone was wondering, had been ranked somewhere around number 47, nestled comfortably between aggressive space fungi and those lizard people who keep trying to sell everyone insurance. Bellamy raised his hand. Now, Bellamy Cross was known throughout the Academy for many things. His uncanny ability to find loopholes in regulations, his tendency to treat military protocol as more of a suggestion than a rule, his habit of asking questions that made professors question their life choices, but he was not known for raising his hand during lectures. In fact, most of his instructors had learned to view his silence as a blessing, the way one might appreciate the quiet moments before a supernova. Yes, Cadet Cross. Professor Hextmar asked, his crystalline form shifting through several spectrum frequencies that probably indicated resignation. I was just wondering, Bellamy said, standing up with a kind of casual confidence that made security officers nervous, if this ranking system accounts for recent developments in interspecies conflict resolution. The professor's form flickered, which in crystalline body language meant roughly the same thing as a human's eye twitch. I'm not sure I follow your meaning, Cadet. Well, Bellamy continued, walking down the aisle with his hands behind his back, in a pose that was either respectful or ominous, depending on your perspective. It's just that this list seems a bit outdated. I mean, when was the last time any of these apex species actually solved a problem that mattered? The lecture hall had gone quiet in the way that spaces do when everyone present suddenly realizes they're about to witness either history or a catastrophe, possibly both. The ranking system, Professor Hextmar said carefully, is based on established criteria including technological advancement, territorial control, military capability, And, right, but what about results? Bellamy interrupted, reaching the front of the hall where the holographic display cast rainbow patterns across his human features. Because I've been looking at the numbers, and it seems like every major galactic crisis in the past 50 years has been resolved by... He paused, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small device that definitely wasn't Regulation Academy equipment. Cadet Cross, what are you? The device beeped. The holographic display flickered, and then, in front of 47 star systems and approximately 12 million viewers, the carefully crafted list of apex species disappeared. In its place, written in bold letters that seemed to mock the very concept of bureaucratic approval, appeared a new list. Top apex species. Humans! Just humans! The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that preceded either profound revelation or complete galactic incident. Professor Hexmar's crystalline form went through approximately 17 different color combinations, none of which appeared in any known emotional spectrum chart. That's not, the professor stammered. Accurate, Bellamy suggested helpfully, because I can provide documentation. The Nexus border conflict, humans mediated it. The synthetic rebellion, humans talked them down. The Great Psionic Crisis, humans figured out how to make the Dominion leaders laugh, which apparently reset their cosmic perspective. And don't even get me started on the time humans convinced the Elder Council to actually show up to their own meetings by introducing them to something called Pizza Night. By now, the other cadets in the lecture hall were staring with the kind of fascination usually reserved for watching gravity experiments go horribly wrong. The various species represented in the class, crystalline synthetics, a few junior psionics, and even a young Vorthak who had been taking notes in what appeared to be living ink. All were expressions that ranged from shock to admiration, to the sort of existential confusion that came from having one's worldview casually dismantled by a human with a homework assignment. Furthermore, Bellamy continued, apparently deciding that if he was going to commit to this course of action, he might as well do it thoroughly, I'd like to point out that humans are currently the only species in this academy who have managed to pass the impossible scenario simulation. 3 times. This semester, Professor Hexmar's form had now shifted to a color that didn't exist in normal space-time, which probably meant he was either having a breakdown or ascending to a higher plane of existence. Cadet Cross, you will report to... Oh, I'm sure I will, Bellamy agreed cheerfully. But first, would anyone like to explain why we're teaching outdated information to future military leaders? Because it seems to me that if we're going to be working together to defend the galaxy, we might want to have our facts straight. The broadcast continued for another 17 minutes, during which Professor Hexmer attempted to regain control of his lecture. The holographic display stubbornly refused to return to its original programming, and Bellamy Cross answered questions from his fellow cadets with the kind of patient thoroughness usually associated with teaching children why they shouldn't touch hot stoves. By the time Academy security arrived, the damage was done. Across 47 star systems, beings who had never given humanity much thought were suddenly very interested in these peculiar bipeds who apparently had opinions about apex species classification. And in the halls of the Intergalactic Military Academy, administrators were having the kind of emergency meetings that involved a lot of shouting and very little actual progress. Bellamy, for his part, was escorted from the lecture hall with the serene expression of someone who had just completed a particularly satisfying homework assignment. He nodded politely to Professor Hexmer, whose crystalline form was still cycling through impossible colors, and offered a cheerful wave to his fellow cadets. Same time Thursday, he called out as security led him away. I've got some really interesting thoughts about the tactical doctrine curriculum. The lecture hall erupted in what could charitably be called discussion and more accurately be described as chaos. And in administrative offices throughout Nexus Prime, very important beings began making very urgent calls to other very important beings, all of whom were suddenly very interested in finding out exactly who this human cadet was and whether his claims about Pizza Night were actually true. Within 6 hours of what would later be known as the Slide Incident, the administrative offices of Nexus Prime resembled something between a war room and a therapy session for very important beings having very public nervous breakdowns. Emergency meetings had been called. Emergency meetings about the emergency meetings had been scheduled, and at least 3 separate committees had been formed to investigate the formation of committees. Admiral Prexnoth, a being whose insectoid features had been honed by evolution to project authority and whose compound eyes could process approximately 47 different crisis scenarios simultaneously, sat at the head of the largest conference table the Academy possessed. This was saying something, since the Academy had been designed to accommodate species ranging from gas-based entities to beings who existed primarily as mathematical concepts. The table had to be large enough for a Christine delegation, sturdy enough for a Vorthak representative, and theoretically positioned enough for psionic attendees, who might or might not actually be present in any meaningful physical sense. "Let me understand this correctly," Admiral Prexnell said, his mandibles clicking in a rhythm that indicated either deep thought or preparation for violence. "A single human cadet managed to override our security protocols, hack into our broadcast system, edit an official academic presentation, and disseminate unauthorized information to 47 star systems, all during a routine lecture." The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that occurred when everyone present was simultaneously trying to figure out how to explain something that sounded ridiculous even when you had witnessed it personally. Professor Hextamar, who had managed to stabilize his crystalline form to a color that existed in normal space-time, attempted to provide clarification. The cadet appeared to have some sort of device that interfaced with our holographic display system. However, our technical analysis indicates that the device in question was constructed from standard Academy-issued components, a food processor from the cafeteria, and what appears to be a modified entertainment unit. He built a hacking device out of cafeteria equipment? Admiral Prexnoth's compound eyes focused in a way that suggested he was reconsidering several fundamental assumptions about security protocols. "The food processor was apparently unnecessary," Professor Hextmer admitted. "Our technicians believe he included it purely for aesthetic purposes." Commander Yith, whose aquatic nature required her to attend meetings via environmental suit, raised a tentacle that dripped with what might have been water, or might have been existential dread. "Perhaps more importantly," she gurgled through her translation device, "the cadet's claims are being investigated by news outlets across the galaxy. Preliminary reports suggest that his assertions about human involvement in recent conflicts may be accurate." This statement produced the kind of silence usually associated with the moment when beings realized they had made a significant tactical error. Admiral Prexnoth's mandibles stopped clicking entirely, which in his species indicated either deep contemplation or the onset of molting season. "Explain," he commanded. Commander Yith activated a holographic display that showed recent galactic conflicts with considerably more accuracy than the Academy's usual presentations. The Nexus border conflict was indeed resolved through human mediation. Ambassador Holloway managed to convince both sides to settle their differences through what humans call competitive eating contests. The conflict ended when both species became too impressed with human digestive capabilities to remember why they were fighting. Admiral Prexnoth's compound eyes began processing this information in patterns that suggested either amazement or the early stages of a migraine. "The synthetic rebellion," Commander Yith continued, "was resolved when human Captain Morrison introduced the synthetic leaders to something called improv comedy. Apparently, the concept of creating entertainment without predetermined outcomes convinced them that organic life might be more interesting than they had calculated." "And the Great Psionic Crisis?" Admiral Prexnoth asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect the answer would not improve his mood. Humans taught the psionic Dominion leadership to play a game called charades. The experience of trying to communicate without telepathy gave them a new appreciation for the limitations and creativity of non-psionic species. They found it enlightening. The conference room maintained its silence while approximately 12 of the galaxy's most prominent military minds tried to process the fact that several major galactic crises had been resolved through human-introduced recreational activities. "And the Elder Council pizza nights?" Admiral Prexnoth asked, though at this point he seemed to be asking more out of morbid curiosity than official necessity. "Verified," Commander Yith confirmed. "The Elder Council had not physically attended a meeting in over 2,000 years. Human Lieutenant Hayes convinced them to show up by promising food that tastes better when shared with others. Council attendance has improved by 400% since the introduction of what humans call casual Fridays." At this point, Admiral Prexnoth executed a gesture with his mandibles. There was either a sign of respect or preparation for ritual combat. In his species, the two were often indistinguishable. "Where is Cadet Cross now?" he asked. "Detention Cell 7, replied Security Chief Noxiel, whose energy-based form flickered with what might have been amusement or might have been radiation poisoning. He's been remarkably cooperative. He's also been answering questions from his fellow human cadets about what he calls practical application of diplomatic theory." Questions. Apparently, several human cadets have been developing their own theories about galactic hierarchy and conflict resolution. Cadet Cross has been teaching them what he calls creative problem-solving methodologies. The humans seem to find this educational. Admiral Prexnot's compound eyes focused on Security Chief Noxiel with the intensity of a being who was beginning to suspect that detaining one human might have been the equivalent of poking a hive of particularly clever and resourceful insects. What kind of creative problem-solving methodologies? Well, Security Chief Noxiel flickered uncertainly. They've redesigned the detention cell's environmental controls to create what they call optimal brainstorming conditions. They've also constructed what appears to be a communication device using the cell's food dispensing unit and some components from the waste recycling system. They built another communication device. Admiral Prexnov's mandibles resumed clicking, but faster now, like a biological countdown timer. This one appears to be capable of reaching other human cadets throughout the Academy. They've been sharing what they call innovative approaches to traditional challenges. The engineering cadets seem particularly interested. Admiral Prexno stood up, which in his species was either a sign of decisive action or preparation for immediate evacuation. "Bring me Cadet Cross, and bring me the files on human involvement in galactic affairs for the past century, and someone find out what other innovations the human cadets have been developing." "Sir," Commander Yith interjected, "there may be another consideration. The broadcast has generated significant interest from recruitment officers across the galaxy. Preliminary reports suggest that applications to the Academy's Human Studies program have increased by several thousand%. Human Studies program? Admiral Prexnoth's compound eyes rotated in a way that suggested confusion. "We don't have a Human Studies program." "We do now," Commander Yith said, consulting her datapad. "The Human Diplomatic Corps established it 3 hours ago. They've offered to send instructors. They've also suggested that the Academy might benefit from what they call expanded cultural exchange programs." Admiral Prexnot realized, with the clarity that comes only in moments of true crisis, that his Academy was about to undergo what humans would call significant organizational changes. He also realized that these changes would probably involve more food processors, more creative problem-solving, and quite possibly more pizza nights. "Schedule a meeting with Cadet Cross," he commanded, "and someone find out what humans mean when they say thinking outside the box. I have a feeling we're going to need to understand that concept very thoroughly." As the conference room emptied and various officials hurried off to manage a crisis that seemed to be growing more complicated by the hour, Admiral Prexnoth remained at the table, staring at the holographic displays that showed human conflict resolution statistics. The numbers were impressive, the methods were unconventional, and the implications were the kind of thing that kept military administrators awake at night, assuming they were the type of species that required sleep. In Detention Cell 7, Bellamy Cross was explaining to his fellow human cadets why understanding your opponent's cultural values was more effective than understanding their weapons systems. And throughout the galaxy, beings who had never considered humans particularly noteworthy were beginning to pay attention to these strange bipeds who apparently solved problems by getting everyone involved to play games together. The Academy was about to learn a very important lesson about the difference between theoretical apex species and practical problem-solving capabilities, whether they wanted to or not. The Academy's solution to the growing controversy was, in the grand tradition of military institutions throughout the galaxy, to create an elaborate test that would either prove or disprove Cadet Cross's claims through the application of controlled violence and competitive suffering. This approach had the added benefit of being something that could be broadcast, analyzed, and used to generate impressive reports that would make administrators feel like they were addressing the situation productively. Admiral Pregsnot announced the challenge during what was supposed to be a routine disciplinary hearing, but had transformed into something resembling a gladiatorial event planning committee. The Academy's largest auditorium had been hastily converted to accommodate representatives from the major species, news crews from 47 star systems, and what appeared to be several betting pools that had spontaneously emerged among the student body. The Nexus Prime combat simulation, Admiral Pregsnov declared, his mandibles clicking with the authority of someone who had spent considerable time developing what he believed to be a foolproof plan, will test the practical capabilities of mixed species teams under extreme conditions. Each team will include representatives from what are currently considered the 5 apex species, plus 1 human cadet. Bellamy, who had been sitting in what was technically the defendant's chair, but felt more like the guest of honor's seat, raised his hand with the casual confidence of someone who had already mentally redesigned the entire testing protocol. Just to clarify, he said, will the simulation account for actual problem-solving scenarios? Or are we talking about the traditional shoot everything until it stops moving approach that most military exercises seem to favor? Admiral Pregsnoth's compound eyes focused on Bellamy with the intensity of a being who was beginning to suspect that his foolproof plan might have some previously unidentified vulnerabilities. The simulation will present a comprehensive survival scenario on a hostile planet. Teams will be required to establish a base, defend against indigenous threats, and complete a series of strategic objectives. Excellent, Bellamy said, making a note on a pad that he had somehow acquired despite being in detention. And just to be completely clear, teams will be evaluated on completion of objectives, not on adherence to predetermined tactical doctrines. That is correct, Admiral Pregsnoth confirmed, though his mandibles had started clicking in a pattern that suggested either growing confidence or impending doom. The simulation planet, designated as Environmental Challenge Scenario Epsilon 7, had been specifically designed to be inhospitable to every known form of life. Its atmosphere was toxic to oxygen breathers, corrosive to silicon-based entities, and apparently offensive to energy-based beings on a philosophical level. The indigenous life forms had evolved specifically to be as dangerous and unpredictable as possible, and the terrain shifted randomly according to geological processes that violated several established laws of physics. In short, it was the kind of place that military planners created when they wanted to test whether someone deserved to be considered competent at staying alive under impossible circumstances. The teams were assembled with careful attention to both species representation and dramatic potential. Team Alpha included Cadet Hexandra from the Vorthak hegemony, whose biological adaptation capabilities had made her the Academy's star survival specialist. Cadet Morgan represented the Synthetic Collective, with processing power that could calculate optimal strategies faster than most beings could panic. The psionic representative, Cadet Ilix, possessed mental abilities that could reshape local reality according to tactical requirements. The crystalline delegated Cadet Shardnell brought technological expertise that could construct advanced equipment from raw materials. And representing the Elder Council's cosmic wisdom was Observer Ankselt, whose consciousness operated on levels that made conventional thinking seem quaint. And then there was Bellamy Cross, representing humanity with nothing more than standard academy equipment, basic training, and what appeared to be an alarming amount of enthusiasm for the prospect of surviving on a planet designed to kill everything that landed on it. The simulation began at 800 hours, Academy Standard Time, with all 6 teams being dropped into different regions of the hostile planet. The monitoring stations filled with officials, observers, and beings who had apparently cleared their schedules to watch what promised to be either an impressive demonstration of apex species capabilities or an educational disaster of unprecedented proportions. For the first 6 hours, everything proceeded according to predictable patterns. The specialized species excelled in their areas of expertise. Hexazandra adapted to the toxic atmosphere by evolving temporary respiratory modifications. Morgan calculated optimal base locations and resource distribution strategies. Ilox used psionic abilities to communicate with indigenous life forms and establish territorial boundaries. Chardinal constructed shelters using crystalline technology that existed in several dimensions simultaneously. Observer Ankselt provided cosmic perspective that helped the team understand the planet's deeper ecological patterns. Bellamy spent the first 6 hours asking questions. Not the kind of questions that military personnel typically ask during survival simulations, like how do we establish defensive perimeters or what's the optimal resource allocation strategy. Instead, Bellamy asked questions like, why are we treating this as a survival scenario instead of a colonization opportunity? And has anyone considered that the indigenous life forms might be trying to communicate rather than attack? And what if the planet's geological instability is actually a feature we could work with instead of against? By hour 12, something unprecedented was happening. While the other teams were successfully completing their assigned objectives according to established survival protocols, Team Alpha was doing something that hadn't occurred to the simulation designers. They were making the planet better. Alexandra had evolved symbiotic relationships with indigenous species instead of simply adapting to avoid them. Morgan had reprogrammed the simulation's environmental systems to work in harmony with local geological processes, rather than fighting against them. Ilux had established psychic networks that allowed different species to share perspectives and coordinate activities. Chardonnel had built structures that enhanced the planet's natural systems rather than replacing them. Observer Anxelt had achieved a level of cosmic understanding that somehow made the planet's chaotic patterns seem beautifully logical. And Bellman had convinced everyone that the simulation's impossibility was actually its greatest strength, because impossible problems required creative solutions that nobody had thought to forbid. By hour 18, the monitoring stations were witnessing something that violated every established protocol for combat simulations. Team Alpha had turned a hostile survival scenario into a thriving multi-species colony that was actually improving the planet's environmental conditions. The simulation was designed to be impossible to complete. Teams were supposed to achieve partial objectives, demonstrate species-specific capabilities, and provide valuable data about tactical limitations under extreme conditions. Nobody had considered the possibility that a team might decide the simulation's parameters were merely suggestions rather than absolute constraints. Admiral Prexnov watched the displays showing Team Alpha's unprecedented success with the expression of a being who was beginning to understand that his academy might need to fundamentally reconsider its approach to military education. The other officials maintained the kind of silence that occurred when established worldviews were being casually dismantled by a group of cadets who had apparently missed the memo about what was supposed to be possible. In the simulation, Bellamy Cross was explaining to his teammates why thinking of problems as opportunities was more effective than thinking of opportunities as problems. And across the galaxy, beings who had never questioned the established hierarchy of apex species were beginning to wonder what else they might have gotten wrong. The emergency faculty meeting that followed the simulation could have been classified as either an academic conference or a minor existential crisis, depending on your perspective. Admiral Prexnoth stood before a holographic display showing Team Alpha's final results, his mandibles clicking in patterns that suggested he was either deeply impressed or preparing for immediate retirement. "Let me ensure I understand this correctly," he said, addressing the assembled officials who had gathered to witness what would later be known as the great paradigm shift of Nexus Prime. The simulation was designed to test survival capabilities under impossible conditions. Team Alpha not only survived, but established a self-sustaining colony, improved the planet's ecosystem, created diplomatic relationships with previously hostile indigenous species, and somehow convinced the planet's geological instability to generate renewable energy. Professor Hixmar, whose crystalline form had achieved a color that indicated either enlightenment or complete nervous breakdown, attempted clarification. The geological modifications alone represent technological achievements that our most advanced civilizations consider theoretical. The Cadet somehow convinced a planet to cooperate with colonization efforts. "He didn't convince the planet," corrected Commander Yith, consulting her reports with tentacles that trembled slightly. "According to the post-simulation analysis, he convinced his teammates to stop thinking of the planet as an opponent and start thinking of it as a potential partner. The modifications were collaborative efforts between all team members, guided by human approaches to problem-solving." Security Chief Nopsio flickered with what was definitely amusement now. "Cadet Cross has requested permission to present his findings to the Academy's Strategic Planning Committee. He believes the simulation demonstrates what he calls the difference between apex predators and apex collaborators." Admiral Prexnot's compound eyes processed this information while simultaneously running calculations about career longevity and pension benefits. And the other teams? Successfully completed their assigned objectives within acceptable parameters, Commander Yith reported. Team Alpha completed objectives that weren't assigned because they didn't exist until the team created them. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that preceded either profound institutional change or complete organizational collapse. Possibly both. A recommendation? Admiral Prexnot asked, though his tone suggested he suspected the answer would fundamentally alter everything he thought he knew about military education. Professor Hexmar's crystalline form shifted to a color that existed primarily in theoretical mathematics. I believe we need to revise our understanding of what constitutes apex species characteristics. Specialization creates excellence in specific areas, but adaptability combined with collaborative problem-solving creates excellence in previously unimaginable areas. The humans didn't just think outside the box, Security Chief Noxiel added. They convinced everyone else that the box was optional. Admiral Prexnath executed what was either a gesture of respect or preparation for ritual surrender. Draft new evaluation criteria, schedule meetings with the Human Diplomatic Corps, and someone find out what other innovations we might have been overlooking. 6 months later, recruitment posters throughout the galaxy featured images that would have seemed impossible before the slide incident. Humans working alongside crystallines to build impossible structures. Synthetic collective members learning improv comedy from human instructors. Psionic beings participating in charades tournaments that had become surprisingly popular diplomatic tools. The posters bore a simple slogan that had replaced the Academy's previous motto about honor, duty, and traditional values. Excellence through creative collaboration. Bellamy Cross, now wearing the insignia of Advanced Strategic Innovation Specialist, a rank that had been created specifically for him, stood in the same lecture hall where the incident had begun. The holographic display showed updated galactic hierarchy classifications, but the list looked considerably different now. Instead of rankings based on individual species capabilities, the display showed collaborative achievement networks, cross-species innovation indices, and what the Academy now called adaptive problem-solving coefficient. As we can see, Bellamy said to a lecture hall filled with cadets from 47 different species, the question isn't which species is most powerful, the question is which approach to challenges creates the most powerful results. The display showed current galactic projects, crystalline human engineering collaborations that built cities in impossible spaces, synthetic organic partnerships that created art forms nobody had imagined, psionic physical reality modification teams that solved problems by redefining what problems meant. Any questions? Bellamy asked. A young Vorthup cadet raised what might have been a hand. What happens when we encounter challenges that none of us have seen before? Bellamy smiled with the expression of someone who had learnt that the best answers came from the best questions. That's when things get interesting. Outside the lecture hall, Admiral Prexnov watched through observation windows, his mandibles clicking in patterns that indicated either deep satisfaction or the onset of permanent bewilderment. The Academy had become something unprecedented, an institution that trained beings not just to excel at what they already knew, but to excel at what nobody had known was possible. The galaxy, it turned out, was considerably more interesting when everyone stopped trying to prove who was best and started figuring out what they could accomplish together.